I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people, to whom it properly belongs. Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States.
The gap between the very richest and the rest of us is getting bigger. Why? A common belief is that it's good for us all if a small group of people earn an enormous amount of money. The theory is that their wealth trickles down to the rest of us. But this is a myth. In reality, money is sucked up from all of us into the pockets of a very small group of people. How does this happen? One reason is the way that money is created. Right now, almost all of the money in our economy is created by banks when they make loans. Now, most people assume that when banks make loans, they're lending out someone else's savings. But they're not.
Right now, we're going to talk about how banks create money out of thin air. Whoa!
Private banks create money out of nothing and lend it at interest.
Banks create money out of nothing through the process of credit creation.
If an accountant creates money out of nothing in the company accounts, it's called cooking the books. But if a bank does it, it's perfectly legal. And so long as you allow fraud to be legalized, then all kinds of problems are going to pop up in the economic system, which you can't do anything about. You're going to say, well, we don't want to change the system. We're making so much money out of it. What we have to do is, A, try and convince the people that it's their fault.
Americans now have the highest revolving debt in U.S. history. According to the Federal Reserve, Americans collectively owe over $1 trillion in credit debt.
Credit card debt is exploding in this country. For the first time in American history, Americans as a whole own more than $1 trillion just to credit card companies.
Buy now, pay later has become a way of life for the normal American. This is not the American dream. It's a trap.
They have to take on debt just to be able to afford the things they were previously able to buy. In reality, this process of creating money only redistributes wealth from the bottom to the top of the pyramid. And thus that ever-increasing gulf between rich and poor gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Economies operate in cycles. They go through booms and busts, expansions and recessions. Therefore, crises should not come as a surprise. Business cycles are a direct cause of excessive credit flow into the market. This is facilitated by an intentionally low interest rate set by the government. This situation gives the false impression that money originally saved for investment has increased and the pool of investable funds is bigger. This creates an illusion and leads to misallocation of investments or malinvestments. Credit inflation is a distortion of what is actually available to support current production and consumption levels. That is why a correction is inevitable. We have been in a booming phase in the long-term economic cycle since 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window. But we are reaching the boom phase of this long-term cycle, meaning we are approaching a devastating bust.
Yeah. The question is, how much longer will the rest of the world throw good money after bad because they don't want to admit the mistakes that they've made?
We are headed into a massive recession. Trump bought the economy some time with the tax cuts, but all it's doing is pushing off the day of reckoning. We had to borrow a lot of money to finance those tax cuts, despite what Donald Trump is saying. The trade deficit now is running at a 10-year high.
But isn't that a function, Peter, of people having more money in their pocket and they are buying more product, whether it's foreign or made here?
They're buying more imported products, but where's the money come from? It's coming from debt.
And Stuart, when I said it's going to be the biggest market downturn in my lifetime, I mean, that's not so strange to me. 2008, we had a problem because of too much debt. Stuart, as you well know, the debt has skyrocketed since 2008. Yep. So when I say it's going to be worse than my lifetime, how could it not be?
And those things, most of the time, not all the time, are unforeseen or uncontrolled.
It leaves them in a position where only one incident, whether it's a job loss, a divorce, an illness, can push them right over the edge.
You actually think you're going to take on a multi-billion-dollar company who studies your behavior more than you study your behavior? Think about it. Did you know the credit card is the most aggressively marketed product in the history of humankind? Why? Because I started understanding that behavior affects your ability to build wealth more than all your little math tricks you think you see all the variables on. The borrower is slave to the lender, and yet you tell me you're going to beat the credit card company. You spend 12 to 18% more on average when you use plastic than when you use cash. That's what all the studies show us, because you don't feel the pain.
I was a lender for 30 years. When you make a loan, you deposit that loan into the borrower's checking account. That's new money in the system. And that new money in the system is what creates a boom. A lot of lending creates a large boom. We think one of the things that has to be addressed are those private debt levels. One thing to consider there is debt restructuring or debt forgiveness. And the ancient word for that is jubilee. We don't think that financial crises can be avoided. And we don't think that financial crises can be properly repaired after the fact if we don't understand what really causes them.
So I want you to think about that, because this biggest market crash is coming. It's guaranteed now.
But I explained that there's a household debt issue of about $15 trillion out there. Is that the only debt that we need to be worried about?
Yeah. No, everybody is loaded up with debt, and it's not like we began this monetary experiment without much debt. We had a lot of debt in 2008. In fact, the financial crisis was about debt. It was about our inability to pay the debt that we had. But instead of addressing the problem and allowing debt to be paid down, the Federal Reserve led us down the primrose path into much deeper debt. In fact, because we kept it going so long, the collapse is going to be that much bigger. I mean, the sooner we face that reality, the better. But no politician wants to face that reality.
Right.
I mean, they want to pretend everything is great.
Right, of course.
The epicenter of this next great world shift will be right here in America. In fact, we've recently passed what I believe to be the point of no return, which means that a crisis is now inevitable and unstoppable. You see, what most people don't realize is that in the 1950s, the United States began switching over to an entirely new kind of economic system. This new system has allowed us to amass more wealth on paper than any other nation in history. Despite the collapse of our industrial sector in the 70s, despite our manufacturing base moving overseas, resulting in lost jobs and broken towns all over America, despite 2 major market crashes in just 15 years, the new system made our economy what it is. As a society, we are now more than ever dependent on convenience, on free government services instead of our own hard work, on credit instead of our own hard-earned cash. You see, this situation never actually got resolved. Instead, it got worse. A McKinsey study tells us that there's $57 trillion more debt today than there was in 2007, and it's growing. In fact, it's being artificially pumped up by the Federal Reserve and other central banks. As you can see from the chart above, our current credit system started around 1950. In the late 70s, traditional American industries such as cars, steel, televisions, radios, even computers moved overseas. Credit came in and replaced traditional wage increases as a way to prop up our economy. Agora warned in 1993 that it would begin to unwind, that the credit cycle would come to an end. That nearly happened in 2000, when the credit system first stalled out and the dot-coms went bust. But then, housing was there to support it. All that credit rushed into the housing market, which then shot up to meteoric levels. But when housing collapsed, there was nothing else to keep us going. That's when the Federal Reserve started buying up bonds and mortgages. Starting with a balance sheet of $700 billion before the crisis, the Federal Reserve is now on the hook for $4.5 trillion. That's how much new cash and credit it has put into the system in the last 6 years. Our lender of last resort, the Federal Reserve, has become too big to fail. Unfortunately, if it does, there's no higher entity that can step in, save our credit system. It has simply gotten too big. That's because none of these countries has ever been able to borrow so much or become so dependent on credit. We're going to see just how dependent we've become, and I'm not looking forward to it. Of course, believing nothing will ever change is actually a form of delusion. Totally irrational. But it's necessary for our survival. The problem, though, is that sometimes things do change, big time, and we are unprepared when really big changes are about to strike. People refuse to believe what's often right in front of them. Lawyers call this willful blindness. Psychologists call it the normalcy bias. That's why, while I was warning our subscribers about the dot-com bubble, for example, plenty of people thought it would never end. A famous book at the time, Dow 36,000, argued that the stock market was cheaper than ever. An article published in The Atlantic read, "Stock prices could double, triple, or even quadruple tomorrow and still not be too high." Then suddenly the Nasdaq started falling and eventually wiped out 77% of its value. Today, I'm seeing the same willful blindness here in America. People believe that our credit economy can just keep going forever, that we can keep borrowing and spending money that really isn't there. They think debt can go up faster than income indefinitely, even though it's mathematically impossible. And now, our highest government officials are still locked in a desperate struggle to keep this system going. Credit is not real money. It's just the flip side of debt. You run up too much debt, and you go broke. And many, many Americans are about to learn this eternal truth the hard way. We can't build the biggest credit system in world history and expect it to stay standing forever.
This is going to be a sequel to 2008. And like all sequels, it's going to be bad. This one is going to have an even worse ending than the last one because it's not going to end with a dollar rally and a sell-off in gold. It's going to end with the opposite. Gold is going to take off and the dollar is going to collapse, and the inflationary recession that is going to follow the bursting of this bubble is going to be far more disruptive and painful for the average American. You know, back in 2008, one of the reasons the dollar had been so weak was because we had large budget deficits and large trade deficits, and people were smart enough to realize that was a problem. Well, today, we have even bigger budget deficits and even bigger trade deficits, and nobody thinks it's a problem at all. In fact, they think it's good for the dollar.
Which we have to do something about, or we can't solve the problem. And the longer we wait, the worse the problem gets. So it's prudent to act sooner rather than later, because time is working against us.
Think about it. You can look at any business, and if you want to know what shifts a business, what shifts your life, there's one force: decision making. Decision making is the force that shapes destiny, personal, corporate, business destiny. How many of you can think of decisions that you made years ago, 1 or 2 decisions, 5, 10, 15 years ago? That decision, you may not have realized at the time, but that decision was one of the most important decisions of your life. If you'd made a different decision there, you've gone a different direction, your life would be completely different today. Who can relate to this in your life? Say I. The secret then is getting darn good at making more effective decisions. But most people don't have the guts to make the tough decisions because they want to make the right decision, so they make no decision. And that's a decision. Isn't it true? And what happens is the world takes them over. So decision making is the power. So if you're going to control your life, the way you take control is by making new choices. If you don't like how things are, what do you got to do? Change it. And to change it, you have to make a decision.